Hi everyone, this is Lisa, and this is an overview of the concept of stress and adaptation, with crisis management being the exemplar. This is what our class is going to look like. We're going to go through some objectives and definitions. I'm going to do a topic overview. After we're done with that, I've set up a Kahoot challenge with some NCLEX style questions for you to test your knowledge. And then, of course, you can go on to your third touch folder where I've got a case study waiting for you. Objectives of the class today are to compare and contrast the three basic types of crisis, to describe the four phases of crisis, to describe what is meant by primary, secondary, and tertiary crisis intervention, to formulate a plan of care for a client in acute crisis, and to identify potential mental health safety needs of clients experiencing acute crises. Our SMCC concept definition of adaptation is the ability of the host to accommodate psychological or physical stimuli that are incompatible with current functioning. And stress and adaptation runs through the curriculum here, where you learned about the body's stress response, the fight or flight reaction, stress management in 125. We'll revisit this again when in 275 when we talk about the role of referrals in client care. So what exactly is a crisis? I think a good definition of it is an acute, time-limited state of emotional disequilibrium. Something has happened to throw us off our game. We feel under threat. And until we regain some semblance of our equilibrium, of control over the situation, we will continue to experience this event as a crisis. Now, clearly, this can lead to some confusion, some anger. Problem solving is definitely affected. You may see physical changes as a result of the fight or flight reactions. Anxiety is usually elevated depending on the perceived level of threat. It can be escalated to a panic level in significant cases. Now, we will be talking more about anxiety as a condition and nursing actions around that in another class coming right up. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about particular interventions around it, but just bear in mind that managing anxiety is a big part of crisis management. And our coping mechanisms are temporarily overwhelmed. What we have used before, we are unable to access, or they're not working for us. It's important to remember that crisis in and of itself is not a pathological state. Stressors may lead to a crisis, but the stress itself is not a crisis, even though it may feel like it sometimes. And often you can look back on it, or people do look back on it, as a turning point in your life. So if you have successful negotiation of a crisis, it can lead to some personal growth, reflection. Unsuccessful, though, can lead to a degradation of skills and some possible personality disorganization. It is fair to assume that all of our clients who are facing a change in their health status are facing varying degrees of crises. So imagine being a client who has just been given a diagnosis with a 6-month life expectancy, for example, or a client diagnosed with a life-altering illness such as multiple sclerosis or schizophrenia, or even the events that we generally perceive as desirable, such as pregnancy, can precipitate a crisis. So in our own work, this is the majority of the people that we deal with and come in contact with can be thought of as experiencing crisis along the continuum. Now, crises come in all different shapes and forms. They are all, but they are all except a few common factors to them. And the first is that they are all experienced suddenly. That's kind of what makes them crises in a way. The stress itself may not be sudden. Things build over time, like the straw that broke the camel's back. You're going on, things are happening. You're stressed, but your defense mechanisms and coping strategies are still working for you, and then something happens. and all of a sudden you simply cannot do it anymore. Your coping mechanisms are overwhelmed, and you are at a loss as to what to do. It can feel life-threatening. People experiencing these crises can feel like their life is over. It will never be the same. They will not be able to manage it. They don't have the skills to pull through it. But the crisis itself will generally resolve in about 4 to 6 weeks. Now, of course, it's very client specific, but in general, it can be looked at, even though it feels like it's life threatening and that it's never going to be over, it really does resolve in about 4 to 6 weeks. And for the client experiencing the crisis, the focus is generally on the present, immediate problem, here and now, how to get over this hump. And for us, it's important to know that early intervention increases the chances for better outcomes, and also that people experiencing crisis are often more willing to engage us during the crisis state than they are afterwards, when a little equilibrium has been regained and the crisis event is further away. For crisis intervention, the first thing that we really need to do is address the immediate crisis. So our goal for the immediate would be to get the person safe, address what's going on immediately, with a long-term goal, really, though, of returning the client back to a pre-crisis level of function or higher. Remember, people can go 3 ways here. They can have some personal growth out of it, they can come out of it essentially the same, or they can come out of it with less function. And so our goal is to essentially bring the person back to where they were or better. For crisis intervention in general, there's a number of ways it can be dealt with now. We're talking, when I'm looking at this list here, we're thinking about people who are in real significant types of crisis. Short-term acute hospitalization is often necessary for people who are in a crisis that they can't manage to be safe with. There are also crisis residential facilities, which are something of a step down from an acute hospitalization. 911 is always available for any type of crisis, emotional or medical, as well as 774 HELP, which is a hotline for people suffering crisis states where there is a professional on the other end of the line who will triage what you may need in order to get through the immediate crisis. There are warm lines, so there's hotlines, which are for people who need professional help, and then there are warm lines, which are peer crisis support. So if I am having a crisis and I want to talk to somebody who has some idea of what it is that I'm going through and can speak to me on that type of level, I would engage a warm line. Again, mobile crises programs, very often the crisis management can come to you. This is especially true in places like the schools, where there are crisis people trained in crisis intervention and assessment who will go to a place to assess a person and figure out what the next step is. And then there are victim outreach programs that can be helpful for people in these situations as well. The 7-step model, now this is only one of many types of models of crisis intervention. This is the one your book uses, though. I think it's actually pretty straightforward. And it talks about how, what's the safe and logical and way to intervene in a crisis and bring people to the goal of pre-crisis functioning. And the first thing, of course, you want to do is conduct an assessment of what is going on. Is the person safe? Safety is always first in these types of things. Is the person at risk of harm to self or others? Which, of course, that needs to be addressed before anything else is. If the person is suicidal or homicidal, measures need to be put in place to deal with that. But also, beyond the immediacy of life and limb, there's also the thought, is the client able to care for themselves? Are they able to care for people whom they have been charged with doing so? So the immediacy of what's going on needs to be dealt with first. And if there are real safety issues, then that, of course, takes priority. We need to quickly establish a therapeutic relationship with people. We talked a lot about that in the Intro to Mental Health class in 175. So we really want to make sure that we have established a good rapport and relationship with people. We want to find out what is the actual problem. What has put this person in a crisis? What was the precipitant? What changed so that you went from managing to not managing? And what is the dealing with feelings and emotions? What is the client's perception of the problem? What you think is the issue, or what seems obvious to you would be the issue, may not be that way to the client. So active listening, validation, figuring out what the client's perception of the event is very important. And then what are some of the things the client can do to help themselves through it? Generating and exploring alternatives can, the timing has to be pretty right in order for that to happen, because people who are in significant crisis states where they're panicking often aren't able to do this until you've managed to get a little bit less intense emotion going on. But basically you want to talk with the client about what have they done in the past when faced with similar circumstances. What are some sources of resilience the client can look to? What are some supports that they have? And figure out how those can be used. And concrete plans, once you've had this this level of intervention thus far, then you can develop and formulate an action plan for what happens next. Based on client strengths, based on previous successes, based on resources, you can come up with some action plan for the client to help resolve these types of crises. And some things you can think about would be, maybe you will join a support group, maybe you will call a peer crisis line, maybe you will go to a battered women's shelter, depending on what it is that's going on. Now, if the stressors are great enough and the concern is great enough, hospitalization may be necessary. It just depends on what it is that you find. And follow-up, again, varies based on client and need, but some plan must be put in place to assess the client towards resolution. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about types of crises. I think it's important to know that these do not exist in vacuums. They can exist with each other, side by side. There's no right or wrong for how a crisis can develop. And I think it's probably pretty obvious that somebody's having a crisis in one area, it may make, and their defenses are down to begin with, it's going to make them probably more susceptible to crisis than other. Maturational, again, based on Erickson's scheme of development, basically happens when you hit a new developmental stage. That's reached. The coping skills that you used before aren't really working for you anymore, so you need to develop some new ones. Some of the things that happen to most of us in this area where we need to re-examine how we're relating to the world are things like leaving home, things like deaths that we experience, deaths of our parents, deaths of our grandparents, interacting and starting families. And if there are unresolved issues along this way, this is pretty vintage Erickson, but if there are unresolved crises that happen, then that's going to fall over into other areas of development, and the person may have a difficult time with transitions going forward. Situational crises are things that are external to us. For example, a financial crisis. We make a bad investment and lose all our money. We have a health status change, which is going to be what we're tasked with handling. We also might have disruptions in our relationships, such as divorce. Adventitious are caused by factors that are outside of everyday life. Things like natural disasters, natural events, national events such as assassinations, terrorist attacks, or being the victim of a violent crime. Your book describes some resolution and sequela of these things, and they follow more or less the same pattern as seen in the 7-step model. Phases of crises. Our first phase is when the problem arises. Person's coping skills are challenged, their anxiety is increased, their problem-solving efforts begin to suffer, but they are not yet at the point where they may not be able to pull themselves together a little bit and resolve it without interference, without intervention, excuse me. Interference, yeah. Second occurs once you have tried your usual coping skills, or you, for whatever reason, aren't able to access them. And so those usual coping and problem-solving skills are starting to fail. Your anxiety rises, the function declines, the person may become fixated and paralyzed by the issue, for example, and they start using different types of coping mechanisms in an attempt to resolve their anxiety and the feelings around it. And some of these may be maladaptive, some of these things like drinking, using substance use, those types of things. If a person hasn't been doing that before, they may turn to some of that as a maladaptive coping mechanism. Phase 3 can happen when the attempts to solve the issue really do fail at this point, and the anxiety starts to increase to almost to a panic level. You may see a number of different uncharacteristic behaviors from the client. There may be a withdrawal. There may be a flight, but with the idea that if the person can't solve the problem, they will do everything in their power to get away from the problem. And finally, in phase 4, that's a complete collapse of coping and defenses that leads to some serious consequences. Significant depressions, confusion, self or other directed violence. And at this point, intervention really is imperative if we're going to have any hope of getting the person back to their pre-level functioning. Ideally, you want to intervene before the client reaches some of these maladaptive responses. Once they start doing that, it becomes harder. You would like to take advantage of a state where rapid therapeutic gains are possible, and that is usually around the one or two phase. Once you reach 3 and 4, it becomes harder just because the person is in a much worse state. In these earlier phases, though, the client is uncomfortable, they are anxious, but they're still their defenses and coping skills still haven't yet collapsed. So they're often more motivated to work and do what it is that you are coaching them to do. And then once the client is out of the crisis state and once some equilibrium has been reached, the uncomfortable feelings are gone, there is often less willingness to work on this. And I tend to give people the example of somebody who's had a heart attack. Now, MIs are usually crisis states for people. They're big wake-up calls. People often are facing mortality issues. Can they continue to work? Am I going to survive this? And so when you are doing teaching around that type of stuff, people are often very, very interested in what you have to say. I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to go to cardiac rehab. And they will jump right into it. And of course, some of them will stay with it, but very often, once that 4 to 6 week window passes, the event becomes remote, the client tends to lapse back into some old habits. So hopefully you can strike while the iron is hot and get a client engaged and a lot of buy-in into some of these interventions that you want to try with them. Again, you always want to consider safety issues first. What the client's level of anxiety is, because that's going to dictate how you approach them or what your interventions are. You want to identify the precipitating event. What is it that's actually going on here? And then you want to find out what the client thinks of the event. What is the client's coping mechanisms? What have they been trying? And what are their supports around it? Are they somebody who is homeless with no family and no intervention and no relationship with healthcare? Or are they somebody who has got a lot of supports out there and can draw on those? And always remember there may be cultural and religious factors that are working either for or against the crisis resolution that you may have to take into account. Some nursing diagnoses examples. Ineffective coping will always work well for these types of things. If the client is suicidal or homicidal, obviously those safety issues are going to take priority. But basically what happens in a crisis management system is that people's coping mechanisms are just broken down. They cannot draw on them anymore. So we need to find a way to enable the client to use those healthy ones again. Planning, again, is going to depend on what it is that you find. It should be done in collaboration with the client when it's safe and appropriate. If a client comes to you in stage 4 or in a panic state, you may have to be pretty directive in order to, before you're able to engage the client in problem solving with you. But always remember that a client in crisis still is a person with agency and still is a person who is able to make their own decisions. So even though they may come to us in not very good shape, we still are obligated to make sure that they are at the center of our planning. Again, some interventions that we use: focus on the immediate concrete problem, interventions to decrease anxiety as needed. This may include things like benzodiazepines, low stimulation, those types of stuff. And you want to be sure that follow-up is provided if needed. Now again, you may be the first person that sees the client in crisis, or you may be the last person that sees the client in crisis. You won't always be responsible for every step of the way, but it's going to be really important for you to know where the client came from, what has already happened, and what it is that's left to do before you assume care of them. Levels of intervention, again, I think you've heard this before in terms of how we provide care to clients in general. Primary care are prevention measures. They are measures designed to prevent crises, and things like mindfulness, yoga, parenting classes. These are things that are designed to prevent the crisis from happening. So there is no crisis going on, but there are things that we are putting in place in order to prevent these crises from happening. So secondary care are the things we do to care for the person during the crises. And again, whether it be hospitalization or a call to 911, taking away sharp objects so the person doesn't hurt themselves. This is what we do for the person while the crisis is occurring. And then there's tertiary care, which is for the person afterwards. I think in things in terms of support programs. Somebody has been diagnosed with cancer. They have gone through a crisis on how they're going to deal with it, what is their mortality going to be, those types of stuff. And so afterwards they're sitting there with a group of people who understand what it is they're going through so that they can hash some of the stuff out with them and get support for the crisis that they have had. I'm going to talk a little bit about crisis intervention for persons with severe or chronic mental illnesses. I would also say that I would put vulnerable populations in general in here. Very often there are less reserves, less support for people in these types of categories. For people with chronic and severe mental illness, there's often the compounding issues of substance use, of homelessness, thought and mood disorders that go on top of it. And those things really, really do impact people's ability to problem solve, to communicate needs. Very often that there is a lack of supportive relationships because these illnesses are chronic and episodic, and they result in behaviors that can be very off-putting. There's a lot of stigma around these types of things, so there's low self-esteem, and we don't have a society that's set up to allow people to succeed. So they often have not had a lot of success as either students or employees, and that gets internalized. And so those defenses are down. And what would be something that would be an easily solvable problem for somebody with more supports and more defenses and better coping skills becomes a crisis for somebody who does not have those. But I think it's always important to remember that we capitalize on the healthy and functional aspect of the person rather than focusing on the weaknesses. That's going to be the way out for almost everybody who comes to us with crises, even though whether they have they're a vulnerable population, have mental illness, or not. Uh, this is where I start talking to you guys about how you take care of yourself. Uh, it says common problems for nurses doing crisis work. That's all of us. Every single one of you, once you get out there, is going to be engaged in crisis work of one degree or another. And we need to learn how to care for ourselves around that so that we don't become the one who's in crisis all the time. Crisis raises our own anxiety. People who are anxious, people who are fearful, that is communicated and it's contagious. So we need to mind ourselves around that. What are going to be our triggers around it? If I am not in control of my emotion and behavior, how can I help the client be in control? And if the client sees that I am anxious over it, it may prevent them from communicating honestly with me. Do I have barriers that promotes patient dependence? Do I not believe that people who are in crisis or of certain behaviors are able and willing to engage in problem solving? Do I set unrealistic goals, both for myself as a care provider and for the client? Do I believe that if I sit and talk to the client, and if I just really listen, and if I'm just really empathetic, I'll be able to help the client solve all the problems? And that's going to set both of us up for failure. And how do I feel about people who are thinking about hurting themselves, thinking about hurting other people, or who come to me with a coping skill of cutting their arms, for example? So it's really, really helpful for me as a provider to examine these types of things because I'm going to come in contact with people in crisis every day. And so I need to find out not just what my triggers are and how I can manage to help take better care of the people I come in contact with, but also how do I take better care of myself? How do I come back and do this day in and day out? Because what I want to do is I want to be the best nurse I can be for whoever crosses my path. And if I engage in some of these types of thought processes or behaviors towards client, then I'm not doing that. And I don't think any of us want to do that. So I think it's all important for us to think as we go forward, what can I do to take care of myself so I can be my best self for the people who come into my care tomorrow? Okay, that is a pretty brief overview of care of the client in crises. It's pretty broad, I know, and pretty nonspecific, but like I said, crises come in all different flavors. There is, under your third touch folder, a case study which deals with a client in a hospital that's having a crisis. It's on some skills that you've learned in previous semesters, therapeutic communication, identifying important data. It's going to allow you to provide some concrete examples of interventions to minimize the client's crises. I want you to think through, it doesn't necessarily ask you these questions directly, but as you're going through, think about what type of crisis is this client experiencing? How do I know? What phase of crisis is this client in, and what gives me that evidence? And there's also an answer key in there for you to review. There's suggested answers that, just because an answer is left that you put in is left off doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. But I would advise you to take some time, go through it, and try and work through the crisis for this person that's under your care in the hospital. Okay, everybody, I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I will talk to you soon.